Hi, my name is Bryn Griffiths. Welcome to the Labour Left podcast summer special. Today, with the sun shining, the holiday season upon us, and the dreadful general election behind us, we're going to discuss the politics of a walk in the countryside. Even lefties get to go for a walk in the countryside when the sun shines. Our guest today is Corinne Fowler, a professor of colonialism and heritage at the University of Leicester. Corinne specialises in colonial history, decolonisation, and the British countryside's relationship to the empire. Her most recent books include Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections, and her latest book is Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain. In 2019, Corinne was seconded from her university to the National Trust to help lay the foundations for new approaches to training, interpretation, and programming about country houses' colonial connections. As part of this secondment, she co-authored the National Trust report on its properties' many links with colonial histories. How are you doing, Corinne?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
So let's start by giving the listeners and watchers a bit of a taste of what you're about. There's a clip here of you on a walk talking about your book. Let's have a look.
I think as a nation, we're not really yet in a place where we've even fully acknowledged colonial history and the impacts it had on colonised nations all over the world. And that it's important to explore all the layers of history, including the history of our countryside, its full history, not just a partial, comforting history, and the way in which imperial wealth really transformed our countryside. But to do it through walking is to really ground yourself in that history and to understand that history is about people and places. It's not just a series of facts.
So, what originally, lovely clip that, by the way. I should really inspire people to want to read the book, I reckon. What really caught my attention about your writing was our shared interest in the communist historians, and most notably E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. What attracted you to Edward's book, and why do you argue that colonial history abroad and Labour history at home count as two sides of the same coin?
Well, I came across E.P. Thompson's book pretty late, actually. I was talking to my friend and a fellow walker who's featured in my book called Raj Pal, and he's an historian and a curator. And he and I often have conversations in his living room, facing his bookshelves so that I can see what I can borrow from him next or talk about what I want to lend to him next. And as we were talking about my book of walks, which I was about to start writing, he grabbed a copy of E.P. Thompson's book, which I'd never actually read because I'm an expert in colonial history, not British Labour history. And I said, okay, I'm going to read this. He said, this is like my old friend, this book. He actually cried when he lent it to me because he said it's like saying goodbye to one of his relatives. It's been really formative of his thinking. So I read this book, and as I was reading it and going through it with a tooth comb, all these colonial figures kept popping up in passing. And I'd be thinking, hang on, wasn't he the governor of Jamaica? Hang on, wasn't he the governor of Barbados? Wasn't he a colonial official? Wasn't that one an East India Company figure? And so as these figures kept popping up, and of course, E.P. Thompson doesn't really comment much on the colonial context because his subject was something else. I started thinking, I wonder what would happen if I followed some of these trails and tried to talk about Labour history and colonial history, not separately, but together. And it was really formative of my idea for the book, for the concept of the book. And one of the reasons I was interested in doing that is that when I do get hostile responses to the research I've done into the English countryside, I often get asked, why don't you talk about the suffering of the working classes? Why don't you talk about child labour in the factories? And I suppose a disingenuous answer might be because I'm an expert in colonial history and I talk about that. But actually, it made me think, well, my own school education about working class history and labour history, agrarian history, and so on is actually quite thin. And I would like to know more about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised that we shouldn't be talking about either colonial history or labour history, agrarian history. We should be talking about all of it at the same time because it's all interlinked. So a lot of the colonial figures, for example, slave owners, plantation owners, East India Company, profiteers, they did come back home and they did spend that money, or their children who inherited their wealth spent that money. And one of the main things they spent that money on was land purchase. So land ownership is a really important legacy of empire on British soil, which really affected daily rural life and the quality of people's experience in the countryside, just local landless people who were thrown off the commons and so on.
I read your book and I love the intertwining of the colonial history with the labour history, which is probably something that I know more about than the colonial history, although as a socialist, I obviously take an interest in both. But I was absolutely hilarious to see that the Spectator and the Telegraph managed to get in both managed to get in preemptive reviews of your book before they read it, and said that its weakness was that it neglected our country's labour history.
You couldn't make it up, could you? But I think it's absolutely, there's an interesting story behind this, because I did read those reviews of my book before it was published, and obviously they hadn't read it because they were saying that I wasn't talking about stuff which I patently and demonstrably do. But at the same time,
of the book, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But I do sometimes email people who write hostile articles like that, and I kindly and diplomatically do talk to them about it. And I did exchange some actual pleasantries around that time and try to initiate dialogue, because I think that we should talk to each other more with people who don't agree with us, so that we're not constantly sniping at each other, but we actually enter into a conversation together, no matter who they are.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I'm very active around the Labour Left podcast on social media, and I make effective use when people get abusive of the old block button. I find it very useful. But Corinne, you seem to advocate a different approach of engagement and talking to people. Even I have a rule that I do that until they get abusive, and then it's the shop. But you seem to go further than that. You seem to enter into correspondence with them. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, when I co-authored the National Trust report, obviously it was a very high-profile media story, and there were lots of people who felt very angry that I'd done that. And so they would write to me angry letters, sometimes hate mail. And I decided after a while to start responding to see what would happen if I sent a polite, inviting email in response to their really angry email. And nearly all the time, and every time I did that, I learned something and they learned something. And it really struck me then how polarized our national conversation has become and doesn't need to become. I think that if we're really going to have serious conversations which are focused on evidence, we have to call each other in to a calmer kind of exchange, and one which isn't kind of polluted before you even begin with mutual suspicion. So I did do that. And I learned also a lot about why people were upset about the National Trust report and how better to communicate with people who might be hostile to my work. It's a question of strategy.
Yeah.
Strategy.
So what was
really.
it, to use a sort of modern phrase? What was triggering them? What really upset them? Because it seems to me, when I doing the background reading for this interview, it seems to me that some of your opponents seem to not like history very much.
I think all nations have parts of their history that they would rather not think about because they're less than salutary. And there's it's easy to focus on your more celebratory sides of your history, even though we're often trying to complicate some of that as well in the way we think about the world wars and so on. But it's much harder to think about colonial history, and it is a really sensitive topic. But one of the things that was upsetting people was that they were under the impression that the National Trust was making the history up, inventing it, or putting some ideological slant on it, when in fact they were just telling it straight. Here's the evidence, here's the sources, and this is what the history is. And a lot of it wasn't even to do with slavery history, which is particularly sensitive. I don't think people get as upset if you talk about East India Company history, because there's not as much awareness about how kind of also perhaps troubling that is as well on many levels. But I think that was part of the reason people got upset, because it simply felt strange and unfamiliar. And I think we need to distinguish between people who are deliberately weaponizing history for political gain and trying to stoke culture wars because they think it might win votes and polarize people in a way that suits their ideological purposes, and people who are genuinely confused by the rhetoric of a small number of hostile people who have very large voices, very large platforms and very amplified voices. So I try to always distinguish between those two groups, because one, I think, is malevolent and it does believe the ends justify the means. And the other is often just needs to hear a different side of the argument and to be called in to discuss the evidence rather than called out. It's the question of how do we talk to each other? How do we have a better quality of conversation? And I think the attitude really matters, and not weaponizing knowledge, but using it as a resource and making that knowledge accessible is really important.
So Celia Richardson, the Director of Communications at the National Trust, which commissioned this piece of work that we're talking about, Celia has a reputation for telling it as it is when she becomes a victim of the war on woke battalions. I'm a huge fan of her Twitter feed. Do you compare notes and tactics? Because she seems to have a sort of more robust rebuttal approach than the one you're suggesting. Yeah. Do you think it's horses for courses? What do you think the difference is?
I think, I think I've definitely got quite a gentle and maybe quite compassionate way of dealing with anyone. And I also realise that a lot of this is not personal at all, because people don't know me personally. Celia's really great because she uses humour. I'm just not as witty as her, to be honest. She just says she does really punchy communications. The one that I liked the other day was that there was a whole thing about training people of colour to work as walk leaders or walk guides for other people of colour, so they felt comfortable walking through the countryside, not so visible, not so maybe exposed, if they came from cities. And there were all these articles in the press, why does the National Trust hate our country so much? And she just said, no, we don't hate our country, we just don't do hate. Which I thought was brilliant. So yeah, I'm sure that if I had her wit to make people smile, I would use it more. But unfortunately,
if anybody listening to the podcast doesn't follow Celia Richardson on Twitter, she's the Director of Communications at the National Trust. Look her up, because she's an absolute treat. She makes me smile very often.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back to the book. Your latest book, Our Island Stories, is structured around 10 walks that reveal many fascinating connections between colonial history and British rural life. Can you You did it a little bit at the outset, but can you tell us a little bit more about the concept for those that haven't read the book? If they buy it for their summer walks and their summer reading, what are they going to get?
Well, as you said, there are 10 walks, but they're scattered all over the UK. So there's starting with the Isle of Jura and my sugar walk, moving down through Wales and my wool walk. And then I've got many other walks in Hampshire, in Dorset, in Cornwall, basically all over the countryside. And the concept behind the book is to explore how colonial activities of all kinds across 4 colonial centuries reshaped the countryside and rural life, both in the 18th and 19th century, but in ways that are still visible and apparent today. So I also didn't want to do these walks alone because I wanted to do them in dialogue with other people. So I asked 10 walking companions to join me. And I start off with Satnam Sanghera walking to Basildon Park from the village of Pangbourne near Reading. And then I kind of walk with a series of people who I think are really important figures who've made great contributions in their own fields, whether they're artists or community activists, writers. They do all kinds of things. Photographers. I walked with Ingrid Pollard through the lakes, who did a very famous sequence of photographs and is probably the most high-profile person I walked with. But I think the idea was not just to talk about bald facts, but to situate those conversations about sensitive history in a really calming environment, in a beautiful series of locations where we could connect with each other, could have a space for reflection on what the human history of those places is and meant, both to local people and to colonized people who were so far off stage, away from the public eye, but whose lives were intertwined with those places in all kinds of interesting ways. And I think that it's like a history book that allows us to reflect on what that history means and what it means to different people and what those landscapes mean to the people that I walked with, but also to all of us, and how this might add another layer, another dimension to our understanding of different places across England, Scotland, and Wales.
I think that's really interesting because what strikes me about your approach to history is its multidisciplinary approach. And some historians, some of the more po-faced historians, have suggested that you're not really a historian. So what's your answer to that criticism that you're diluting academic history by adopting this multidisciplinary approach?
Yeah, that's quite funny. I think it's mostly newspapers who said I'm not a proper historian, because I think that was an ideological attempt to discredit the National Trust report, which is actually not. It's just an audit of peer-reviewed academic research about National Trust houses produced over the last 20 years or so. But I think, in terms of my academic location, I am interdisciplinary. I kind of cross over from history to literature. My PhD was actually a history of British ideas about Afghanistan. So it was drawing from historical and literary sources. But I think it's also, I think academics really like my work, actually. They don't have a problem with it on the whole. Only people who write books which are quite prominent pieces of disinformation about empire, and that's just not my opinion, and most experts in the field would think that my work wasn't kind of serious or of high quality. But it's certainly, my approach is not to just talk about the facts. I want to produce a narrative, and which is accessible and relatable and meaningful to people and accessible to non-experts in the field. I don't want my work to be read by 60 other historians and that's it. it just seems a wasted opportunity to have a broader conversation about how our countryside was reshaped by the British Empire.
Congratulations, it worked for me. It was a fantastic book. And if we're going to create a people's history from below, we want people to be able to read it. That seems the point to me. So yeah, if it was a dry academic task, if you're writing a different kind of history, it would be failing in its endeavours, I think. I'd like to take you to a music festival I attended a while ago, the Celtic Connections Music Festival in Glasgow. It was an amazing event, and I went to a session where I learned through the music of Gaelic folk singers, or Gaelic folk singers, I should say, because it's Scotland, isn't it, about the people's history of the enclosure movement, where agricultural workers were driven from the land. And in this case, because they were talking about the North and South Uist and Harris, they were effectively forced to emigrate to Canada. And they put on this whole wonderful performance called the Atlantic Odyssey. And I was on holiday up there on the Uist, not Jura where you went. I went there when I was a teenager. And what I found in your book that I want you to tell us more about, that I just blissfully unaware of, was that there is a direct link between the slavery trade and the actions of Hebridean landowners at home. What is it that brings together the story of the enclosure movement with Scottish people getting driven from their lands and slavery in the West Indies?
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? There was, what led me into this was some work by a couple of Scottish historians who had done a survey of land which is part of the history of the Highland clearances. And when they surveyed that land, they cross-referenced it with the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database to see if there was any slavery connection to large-scale land ownership in the Highlands and Islands. And what they found was that there was a significant connection between slave owners and land ownership in Scotland. And then there's another historian at the same time who has taken that further by mapping on East India Company connections, which I'll come back to the slavery connection in a moment, to show that so many developments in rural, remote Scotland are connected to the influx of imperial wealth from India as well. So people are coming back with eye-watering sums, as the historian Andrew McKillop puts it, to these remote places in the Highlands and in Western Scotland and the islands. So the Jura Walk is really looking at a couple of figures. It's focused on the Campbell family. And the Campbell.
And you had a very interesting partner to walk with, I think.
Yeah. So my walking partner for that chapter is Graham Campbell, and he is the SNP's first councillor of Caribbean heritage, and his family is originally from Jamaica, but also Scotland. So he's always been intrigued about his surname because he knows that there's a slavery connection. But our walk was really not just a walk, it was a quest to know what his family history was and whether it was connected to the Argyllshire Campbells, who were deeply involved in the slavery business. And so we went to the Isle of Jura at Graham's request to explore this and to look at figures like Daniel Campbell, who was an MP who started off life getting involved in both tobacco trade, which was produced by enslaved people, but also in transporting enslaved people. And then the Isle of Jura was also owned at one point by somebody and his trustee with slavery wealth too. So we just explored some of that. But I think the interesting moment in that chapter is when, on the way to the Isle of Jura, Graham Campbell, my walking companion, asked me to stop outside Inverary Castle. And he stood there and he said, "This is the seat of the Campbell clan in Argyllshire. And they have an annual clan gathering and they don't invite me. Why they never invite me? Why am I not invited?" So that whole chapter is exploring that connection. But as you know, I also have an enclosure chapter in my book, which is much further south in Norfolk and Suffolk.
Nearer to where I
that
live
shows
today.
the connection too. Yeah, because obviously the connection with enclosure is very strong, and it's not really known about by lots of people, that the same people who were colonial figures were also the same people who tended to be buying up land, enclosing it, privatising it, laying those hedges and throwing people off the commons.
Yeah, just going back to our friends in the Spectator and the Daily Telegraph, and when they were calling for you to address Labour history, I'm not quite sure this is what they had in mind.
No, possibly not. Yeah, I think they wanted me to perhaps focus exclusively on the sufferings and the genuine sufferings of people who were working in the cotton mills and so on.
I really liked in this Celtic Connections gig that I went to that they had Gaelic singers that are still on the islands, sharing their music with people from Canada. And seeing how their music had travelled the Atlantic in the opposite direction, and their songs were still alive. So the notion that there's your SNP colleague here with his name Campbell, but then there's these people singing the songs of the islands because of the same leads.
Yeah, no, I think you also,
story,
when the clearances happened, people were leaving Scotland out of desperation. They were going to British colonies as well. I think we forget that. It's, well, what happened? What happened to them, and what were those? What was the setup in those colonies, and did they have a better life, and at whose expense ultimately, or did they suffer? I mean, quite often it was very unsuccessful for people, and they really suffered in those former colonies as well.
Because some of the people that went found themselves working for the slave owners, didn't they? And
I do mention Robbie Burns, and how Robbie Burns, this quintessential Scottish poet who I talked about with Graham on the walk, was himself about to go to be an overseer on a plantation in Jamaica, but he never went because his poems suddenly got critical acclaim and he decided to stay. He bought his ticket to go, but he never actually went to take up the position. And I think this is that story that we don't talk about so much, where a lot of agricultural labourers like himself, Robbie Burns, were trying to seek not their fortunes, just have a better life by living in these colonies and by working on plantations. So there were lots of people who went to try for a better life there, but obviously that's a very complicated story because of how they were going to earn their wealth, their money.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about your book is that you're not judging, you're explaining, you're recording.
No, exactly.
The facts are speaking, but you're not seeking to denounce the families of people that have this history. You're seeking to understand.
No, exactly. And I think when is understanding a good, a bad, anything but a good thing? And I think that often before I give talks, or sometimes if I think that there might be some hostile people in an event, I often start by saying, I'm not lecturing. I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty. I'm just trying to understand this aspect of the past. This is what I do for my job, It sometimes helps. It sometimes gets people off the defensive.
I started off with the chapter where I had some of my most memorable childhood holidays in the Hebrides, and in particular Jura. But I spent my youth living in the Pennines. So another chapter that really spoke to me that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I must say I felt enormous pride about, was your cotton walk in East Lancashire. Please can you tell us about the wonderful story of solidarity between starving Lancashire cotton workers during the cotton famine and the anti-slavery struggles across the Atlantic?
The people who were mill workers, obviously in East Lancashire, that was a massive part of the productive economy. And in many towns, it was the only show in town. It was cotton. These were cotton towns. And I was fascinated to learn in a bit more detail how bad things got for people when, during the 1860 Civil War in the US, the cotton could no longer be exported through those ports like Manchester and Liverpool into these cotton towns in East Lancashire. And so the mills, after a couple of years, once they'd run out of their supply of raw cotton, they ground to a halt. And so I went into the kind of very local history of a little mill town called Darwin and looked at what happened to people when there was no work, because the mill was the main employer. And so they were doing all kinds of work in order to access or activate the kind of funds from poor relief. They had to break stones in quarries, they had to make paths, they had to do all kinds of outdoor work, which was really hard for them because they were hungry, they were tired, they were running out of money, they were really struggling to get a proper diet because of this, what's known as the cotton famine, when cotton wasn't coming in. But in Rochdale, which is not far from Darwin, the people of Rochdale, despite all of that suffering and the loss of income and all the things that came with it, the poverty and so on, they really took Lincoln's side and the anti-slavery side, and they showed a lot of solidarity. You know, they took sides, even though the national government wasn't taking sides because cotton was so important to our national profits at that time. They kind of took a neutral side. But the people of Rochdale showed full solidarity with enslaved people and the cause. And in exchange for that, they were given barrels of food, which was sailed over in a ship called the Griswold, which then you can still see those barrels marked with saying thank you for showing solidarity in hard time. I would really like to see them. I think they're featured on David Olusoga's Black and British: A Forgotten History. And he's got a whole episode about the cotton famine, which was partly the inspiration for my chapter. And I just went more into the very, very local history of how it actually impacted people at the time. But I think that not everybody, just to complicate things, not everybody showed solidarity with the anti-slavery cause. So there were some people who just wanted it all to be over. They didn't consider themselves as political, and they just wanted the cotton famine to be over. They didn't really care that much about the Civil War, but a lot of people really did. And then on the other part of that chapter, there's the visit of Gandhi.
To Greenfield Mill, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a tale of two continents in meeting in that one town of Darwin, because in the pre-independence days, Gandhi came over to talk about the cotton boycott that was going on as part of the the pro-independence activism in India, all over India. And he was invited while he visited the UK to visit the mills in Darwin. And so I tell that story as well, because he really won people over there. He said, look, you think you're badly off because of our cotton boycott. You should see what it's like for Indians. And he persuaded them that they should show solidarity. And there are some lovely pictures of all the people who are factory workers just celebrating around him, celebrating the fact that he was there and clamoring to be close to him or touch him or whatever.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's a great story. Corinne, you're probably most famous, although hopefully the book's going to get you even more profile, but you're probably most famous for co-authoring a report into the colonial history of properties belonging to the National Trust. back in 2020. Tell us the story about what you did there, and also, again, why that proved to be so controversial.
Yeah, well, I was leading up to the authoring of that report. I was working with the National Trust. I had a child-led history and writing project called Colonial Countryside. And the idea was to work with a team of historians to explore the colonial histories of National Trust houses. So we chose 10 National Trust houses, and we chose 100 pupils who were identified by their teachers as being particularly keen on history. And we all explored those histories together. We made videos, the children wrote stories.
Should we stop there? Should we just stop there for a moment, Corinne? Let's just show the viewers and listeners a clip, because I think there's this wonderful clip of the children that appeared on the television news really tells the story.
There are hundreds of graves here, but the children have come to see one in particular. 300 years old, the inscription is barely legible, but a sign next to it reveals all.
Here lieth the body of Myrtilla, Negro slave to Mr. Thomas Beecham of Nevis, buried January 6, 1705.
Little is known about Myrtilla, a slave working in the Caribbean. Her owner apparently brought her here from his sugar plantation. No one knows why she came, or why she's buried here at St Lawrence's Church in Oxhill for all to see.
Maybe when she was brought over, she might have felt very scared because she was taken away from her family.
I think it's important that we learn about that so it never happens again.
Tell us some more now people have seen the clip and have got a flavour of what was happening.
Well, I think that within the National Trust, there had been a lot of work over a quarter of a century, actually, to start addressing the colonial histories of its properties. So it was both familiar to people in the National Trust, but also unfamiliar, because there's always a lot more research to do. And so I was seconded to the National Trust because the National Trust really wanted to make a more concerted effort to tell some of those colonial stories. And while I was seconded, part of my work was to produce this report, which was, as I say, an audit of all the academic published research done so far on that topic, and put it all together in one place and to see what we got. And what it showed was that a third of all National Trust properties were connected in multiple ways to colonial activity of all kinds. And that's quite a significant proportion when they've got 300 properties, and these properties are visited by nearly 6 million people. It was a big story. So we published the report knowing it was sensitive, knowing that it might get some backlash, but we did it anyway because it would be dishonest not to tell stories which are centrally relevant to the history of those properties.
And it worked. It worked. Those children really sort of, it's great. And I think engaging communities in their own history and understanding how multifaceted it is, it's just, as you said before, how can that possibly be a bad thing?
Yeah. But
Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks that the National Trust regrettably dislikes our nation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was. I must say, I didn't expect such a response at such a high political level. I mean, there were cabinet ministers attacking the National Trust, me even, at one point. Well, for quite a long time, it was really quite a sustained attack and a very big backlash. So
appearances in Hansard, I seem to recall.
Yeah, it's all in Hansard. You can see all the records of it in the parliamentary records. Just Google Jacob Rees-Mogg and National Trust report and it all comes up. And there were 2 parliamentary debates about it. So it did cause a stir. But the main thing is people might not generally, broadly have known about this history. Now they do know. So good. So
coming back to E.P. Thompson, I talked about how your story of the Lancashire walk in the Pennines made me feel pride. And so E.P. Thompson, the communist historians, Rodney Hilton, Hobsbawm, Raphael Samuel, all those people, I think, are trying to tell a different people's history from below. Maybe not indifferent, just broader, all-inclusive, to tell the missing bit. And so it's not just about kings, queens, and generals. Now, where that takes me is that I think that we can reclaim our history. And I wonder what, I'm going to take you to Billy Bragg and his concept of the progressive patriot. When you tell these stories of the people's history from below and the cotton workers in Lancashire, can we get to a place where we can have a broader, more inclusive history that can make us progressive patriots?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so many times I got called unpatriotic for talking about this history and for doing the report. And I just thought, hang on, since when is it unpatriotic to tell the truth? And also, why is it such a problem to tell inclusive histories, which are thinking not just about a small island history, but how all of these shared histories and interconnections are, worth exploring. So, yeah, I would hope so. I mean, one of the things I liked about what E.P. Thompson said is that he wanted to rescue working class and labour history from the condescension of middle and upper class historians, because it was, it's true that so often, even when I was a child, you would hear, there were bread riots, there was a mob, or there was a political mob, and you just think, well, what were they actually saying? And what about the intellectual life of the labouring classes? Why don't we talk about that enough? I know that there are people with their interests in it, but more broadly, I don't think you learn much about that at school either. And I think that's a problem, because it makes you less critical and less aware of the roots of stuff.
In Manchester, the Peterloo massacre is a very important part of our history. And I'll tell you a great countryside story. The Rush Cart annual festival held by the local Morris men, they drag a rush cart from village to village. And the squire, who's the leader of the Morris for the year, gets to choose the tapestry that's put on the front of the rush cart. And a few years ago, when it was the anniversary of Peterloo, they had a tapestry on the Saddleworth Morris men's rush cart as they dragged it from village to village. I thought that was absolutely marvellous. Wonderful story.
Well, and also, I think, with the history of the swing riots and stuff, the amount of time that the people involved in the swing riots came into kind of clashed with slave owners who in their big houses. It's absolutely fascinating. So I try to cover that in my in my work as well, because I think you forget that the people who live in these grand houses were newly wealthy. They weren't necessarily established property families at all.
In that context of sort of trying to sort of say we have got a positive history, we just need to tell it. The title "Green and Unpleasant Land" sort of sat slightly uneasily with me. Is the slave owners and the generals and the aristocrats fit my picture of unpleasantness, but some of the stories you tell are extremely positive stories about our country that we can be very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we do need to remember our inspiring figures. The people who resisted slavery, the people who resisted all kinds of indignities of wage suppression and so on. They're always heroes to remember and to be inspired by. I think that's really important. The people who were colonized, who resisted colonization in all kinds of ingenious ways, Toussaint Louverture, all of those really interesting figures who were just ingenious in so many ways. And in many ways, represented the best of Enlightenment values, as I spoke about with Pete Carlew on my tobacco walk in Whitehaven. There's a lot of incredible. There's so much to discover that it is worth knowing, worth understanding.
Yeah, and when you tell those stories, when you try to complete our history by telling the history from below as well as the one from above, you're told by the Daily Telegraph you're at war with the past. Nigel Farage says you're trashing our nation, and 59 members of the Tory Common Sense group declared the Battle of Britain.
Oh, I know. Well,
it caused a stir.
Yeah, it did cause a stir, but that was the main purpose was to provide information and a useful resource, and of course it did upset people. I mean, I on the 59 Common Sense group of MPs, they actually, I found what they did quite disturbing, because they went to my funders, the Heritage Lottery and the Arts Council, because for my Colonial Countryside project, which was still going on at the time, they really hated it. They said it was a Maoist re-education.
Maoist?
Yeah. really, really bizarre. It was just an evidence-based, calm, quiet project about colonial history, which is in the public domain already, so they went to my funders and they said that my project was a political project. Therefore, public money should not be given to politics because it was against the law, and therefore I should not receive any more public funding. I think the use and abuse of political power in that way is disturbing when it comes from any party. It's interference at the worst level. And there are certain principles around that time and around all of the work that's been done on colonial history and museum sector, as well as the heritage sector, where the arm's length principle is absolutely vital for any government not to interfere, not to impose its political views on the work that curators and museums and heritage professionals are doing in their own domains of expertise. And that level of interference really just never leads anywhere good, because independence is really, really important for anything which is public sector facing. You do not want that level of interference. It's really unhelpful.
That leads us nicely back to the National Trust. It must be many years ago that I became aware that there was political conflict within the National Trust. I first noticed it was brewing around blood sports, and there was some votes on fox hunting and hare coursing and what have you that seemed to become annual battles at the AGM. But more recently, I think probably in the context of your various studies, we've seen the creation of Restore Trust that are striving to take control of the National Trust. Tell us about their politics. Who are they and what are they about?
I think the problem is that we don't fully know who they are, where the money comes from, and what, they're a registered company, but they are both National Trust members and not National Trust members. Some of them are people who left the National Trust in protest against the report. As an aside, I would just point out that more people joined the trust after the report than left it. That's really important to say, because it's the newspapers were saying people were leaving in droves. That's not correct. It was a small number of people, but they're quite powerful people and they have access to big platforms. And so that group seems to be saying that the National Trust should not get involved in talking about it. They think that talking about colonial history is too political a thing for the National Trust to do, and therefore they should focus instead on conservation and just making these places available and pleasant for the public to visit. That seems to be their position, but I think they've shifted their position, because at first they were saying inaccurate things about the National Trust report. So they were saying, for example, that the report was littered with errors without ever providing any evidence of any error in the report at all. And when finally pressed in a media interview to say, well, where are the errors? Can you give an example? Their example was Kedleston Hall, and it wasn't the report, it was a website, a factual inaccuracy on a website about Kedleston Hall, which had nothing to do with the National Trust report. And so, the thing is, mud sticks, doesn't it, when people throw it? That's partly the tactic. And I think they were keen to try and discredit the report and not, as I point out, the report is not original work. It's just a survey of proper published academic research by hundreds of historians who are experts in the field. So having failed on that front, I think they kind of moved into opposing other things like rewilding and some of the work that the National Trust is doing around inclusion and having walk guides, that I mentioned before, of colour to try and help the countryside be a more inclusive and welcoming space. And yeah, that's what's, they kind of shifted their focus, I think. And they started, I think they kind of realised they didn't win that battle and they just moved on to something else.
My favourite and most absurd fight that they picked was the vegan scones. What Celia in the National Trust Comms office calls woke scone gate.
Oh dear, yeah, I know, but it ought to be Restore Trust Gate. I mean, the amount of things that have been said which are not true and which are really just counterfactual. I think it's just, we'll see what happens. It doesn't matter how much funding you put into something. Sometimes it just never works. It's whether the British public has an appetite for this sort of thing or not.
And so one of the things that we spoke about earlier was your interdisciplinary approach to history. And one of the things that I loved in your earlier book was the fact that you used poetry as well. And so I asked you if you'd like to choose a poem to capture your love of the countryside. Which one did you choose, Corinne? Would you like to read it?
I actually chose a poem about a village church, actually, because one of the things I've tried to do in my last book, and especially in this book, is to remember that lots of places in the countryside used to be perhaps more multicultural in the past than they are today, but not always for happy reasons. And so wherever I went, I tried to look into the history of the Black presence in the UK in the 18th and 19th centuries, in these little hamlets and villages and so on. And one of the things I write about in Green Unpleasant Land, which perhaps I should have had a question mark afterwards for on reflection. I just like the ring and the play on words, but you have to think about all eventualities, don't you? Was a woman called Myrtilla, whose grave is in St. Lawrence Church in Oxhill near Charcote Park. And so I'll read that to you because it's all about what we know about who she was and why she was there in the 18th century. So it's called Myrtilla. Sir Lawrence Church, Oxhill, 1705. 6 men shoulder your pall, servants with your complexion. The coffin scrapes a buttress, your knuckle raps the casket base. Beauchamp's arm shoots up, the procession halts. Mr. Beauchamp's called a gentleman, you his cargo, shipped from Nevis Island to Queen Square. You saw everything, said nothing, gave away the tenderness you craved, raised the master's Beauchamp, nursed and cradled waifs of a life unlived. Myrtilla, evergreen, with showers of gold. Your tomb cold shoulders the family plot. Myrtilla, black girl, Negro slave. Lichens grow, earth breathes, grasses weave. And what I read at the end there was what's written on her gravestone, and tried to imagine her as a person and to not talk about her in a way that didn't, shows that common empathy gap, that we really need a bit more empathy and imagination to think about what life was like for so many people like her who were servants and formerly enslaved people in the Warwickshire countryside.
I think that takes me to, you talk about Raymond Williams in that book, don't you?
I do. The country and the city. Yeah.
That use of poetry as part of your history really takes me to the way Williams and people like Stuart Hall, drawing on Gramsci, talk about the ideas of common sense and how ideas are formed and how the narrative of what matters is written. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's partly why I did it. It's always just part of this quest to not just talk about the facts, but to think about what the experiences might have been like, to use the imagination.
Stuart Hall talks about popular culture. This is a quote from him. Popular culture is one of the sites where this struggle is for and against culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. It is the arena of consent and resistance. And I think that when we talk about ideas and we talk about the dominant narrative in our history, culture's got to be an important part of that. And I was reading Stuart Hall been written about in the New Yorker, and that's such a different approach to David Starkey. David Starkey, an honorary fellow of Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, has a much narrower concept of what history is, and suggested that because of that kind of interdisciplinary approach, he said you are not a historian in any sense of the word.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, what I love about that article, thank you. I mean, he did write an article about you can't trust the National Trust history, and then he gives this example as Penrhyn Castle, and when his account of what happened to Penrhyn Castle and the slate quarry associated with it is inaccurate. The irony of the whole thing is he said it was built with compensation money from the legacy of as recorded in the Legacy of British Slave Ownership project. But it wasn't. It was paid for with Jamaican wealth way before the slavery abolition happened. So I found it amusing that he was calling me a poor historian when he himself was making basic errors about Penrhyn Castle's history, which I know in great detail. So I challenge him to look at any of my academic publications and find these gaping holes in them that he seems to think he would find.
Yeah, he seems to think there is a history when history is so obviously contested. It's a discussion.
Yeah, exactly. But I think there's I do try to stay within my area of expertise. I think what troubles me about a lot of these new books that are coming out, I've got one up there, Nigel Biggar's Colonialism, is that people are coming at the topic and writing very powerful kind of disinformation as part of a disinformation campaign, writing powerful defenses of empire, which is selling far more books than many of the rest of us, who are at least can be shown to be using research rigor in a way that has the university checks and balances on the use of evidence, transparency about your evidence, not cherry picking evidence, not editorializing too much, and just showing your sources and allowing other people to check your historical process and methodology.
So now you've found yourself, whether you like it or not, on the front line of the war against woke. You're defending institutions like the National Trust. What's your next big project? What's Corinne going to do next?
I don't know. I'd really like this book to be a good resource for lots of reasons. I'm sort of really still focused on that because it only came out in May. I'm thinking about other walks elsewhere, and I'm also very interested in continuing work on how we can decontaminate our public conversation. I'm really interested in that. So I'm not quite sure yet. It will be a continuation of the same kind of work, but I'm quite keen to look at British history from the outside more as I go along. And one of the people I walked with was Ibrahim Seck, who was he's a Senegalese researcher. I found his view of the British landscape fascinating. The things he said as we walked along and the perspectives he had on the architecture and the history were just mind-blowing. So a few more of those conversations, I think.
That sounds interesting. I'll definitely be buying your next book, whatever it is about. Which finally brings us to the end of the podcast. But all my regular listeners and watchers will know that at this point, I always invite the guests to name their class hero of the month, somebody who's been a huge inspiration to them. In your case, presumably inspiration for writing books such as the ones we've been talking about. So, Corinne, who is your class hero?
Am I
what
allowed?
did they do? Why are they going to be in our Hall of Fame? Personally, I reckon your friend Celia should be a contender.
I know. So I'm allowed to choose someone living, right?
Yeah, you can choose who you like.
Yeah. Well, actually, my class hero is one of my walking companions, Barty Palmer. She has such an interesting history because she was brought up. She's an artist. She's a fine artist now and has a really good career in the arts. But what I love about her work is that she's really interested in textiles because it's integral to her own family history. Her father worked in a textile factory. Her mother was at home, and she has really explored the history of textiles sort of all her life. But going back to when she was a girl, she had such an unpromising start because she came to school without speaking any English, and she had a lot of catching up to do. The school wasn't necessarily that culturally sensitive towards her back then in the 70s, and she had a lot of obstacles to overcome. But what I love about her is she's just so passionate about telling those stories, and in her art she documents things as they happen. So, for example, during the COVID and the lockdown, she did a whole tapestry, and she did one square of that tapestry for every day, what was happening both in Britain and in the world. And it's all sewed into this cloth. You can see it now at Whitworth Art Museum and Art Gallery. But I just love the way she works. She did a brilliant exhibition on Gandhi and his connection to working class mill workers in the 1930s, as I alluded to earlier. And she's just really good at bringing together that larger intercontinental history with the history of Britain and of Labour, really. And so I just love her work. I love her approach, and she's just so much fun as well too. She's a good friend of mine, so she's my hero for sure.
That's great. I'm beginning to love this feature. I was never quite sure where it would go when we started it, but we get such a range. We get people that go for people like Tony Benn, but then Jeremy Gilbert, who came on to speak about Thatcherism, chose a councillor that lived on his estate when he was a child that inspired him to think about the world differently. We've had a comedian. It's really insightful to hear who people choose, and
yeah,
I think it says something. Your choice says a lot about your breadth of approach to history, so I love that. Anyway, Corinne, thanks ever so much for your time. I hope this encourages people to read and buy your book. It's coming up on the screen now, so people can see it. I can't think of a better book if you're going, especially if you're going to one of the places that's covered. And each of the walks has a map, doesn't it? If you fancy doing it yourself.
And the walks are around 7 miles, so they're not too arduous. Except in the lakes, I stretch it out to 11 kilometres. But yeah, I think they're doable easily in a day.
But could take a while because there's a lot to read on the way.
There's an audio book too, so people could listen if they were on their own.
Oh, I chose to do the audio book, and it was you that narrated it, wasn't it?
It was. It took 4 days.
Gosh, it was great. I really enjoyed it. It was a great format. I think the audible format, if people are thinking of reading the book, I thought the audible format worked really well. And I think you had the voices of some of the people you worked with as well at various points.
Yeah, it's not flat audio. It's got some conversation, some exchange. Yeah.
So highly recommended. Anyway, thanks very much, Corinne, and
thank you.
I wish you all the good and well for the future.
Thanks so much. That was lovely talking to you.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to the fascinating, inspiring Corinne Fowler, and you've been inspired to go on some interesting walks this summer. This was the first Labour Left podcast to take place under the new Labour government. If, like me, you're thinking long and hard about what the Labour Left should do next, I urge you to look at some of our previous episodes. A good place to start would be Labour Hub's Mike Phipps, who urged that we don't stop thinking about tomorrow, and Momentum's Rachel Godfrey-Wood, who spoke about the post-election opportunities we would face under a Labour government. With a Tory party leadership election to understand and grapple with, our examination of Thatcherism with Jeremy Gilbert is unmissable. Finally, can I ask you all a big favour? Our listenership is growing. We now have 200 subscribers, but we need your support to reach a wider audience. To help us, can you share, follow, like, rate and comment on your favourite YouTube or podcast platform? Each time you do any of these things, it helps push our podcast out to an ever-growing number of listeners. After the general election, the Labour Left podcast is going to take a hard-earned rest, and we're going to be back for the conference season in autumn. See you next time.